founder of the Alaska Staff Development Network. Hope for many of you, this will be a new platform, Zoom. We've done about 250 webinars over the last 7 or 8 years, and with the Adobe Connect system. So we're moving to this new system, and hopefully it'll work well. We think it's the best system available for webinars. This is webinar number 1 of our 6-part webinar series, The Other Side of the Report Card, Supporting Social and Emotional Learning in Your Classroom, School, and District, with Dr. Maurice Elias and several of his colleagues. You've already met Dr. Melissa Crane, our online support person who makes this all work technologically. We have Maurice in New Jersey and the rest of us in Alaska. Before I have the pleasure of introducing Maurice, I want to introduce my colleague and a long-time ASDN consultant, Diana Kirka, who's the credit course instructor. She'll come on at the end of Maurice's presentation, explain details of those of you who might like to sign up for a 2-credit course that Diana has designed to extend the learning opportunity from these 6 webinars and do some short follow-up assignments. And she'll also explain the class resource page and how to register for the credit course, which is optional. We have 75 folks as of about 5 minutes ago enrolled from all over Alaska, from Southeast Alaska to the North Slope. So welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure now to introduce Maurice, one of the nation's leading experts in social emotional learning and character development. I've known Maurice for several years and have had the opportunity to attend a number of his presentations at national conferences. We're thrilled to bring Dr. Elias and several of his colleagues to Alaska virtually this fall. Let me tell you a little bit about him. He's a real superstar in the area of social emotional learning and character development. He's a professor in the psychology department at Rutgers University. Yay, Rutgers, my home state of New Jersey. Director of the Rutgers Social Emotional Learning Lab and academic director of the collaborative Rutgers Center for Community-Based Research and Service. He's past president of the Society for Community Research and Action Division of Community Psychology of the American Psychology Association. He's received the SCRA Distinguished Contribution to Practice and Ethnic Minority Mentoring Awards, as well as the APA's National Psychological Consultants to Management Award. Professor Elias lectures nationally and internationally to educators and parents about students' emotional intelligence, school success, and social, emotional, and character development. He's a recent recipient of the Sanford McDonald Award for Lifetime Achievement in Character Education. He's published numerous books, including ASCD's Promoting Social and Emotional Learning, Guidelines for Educators, the Social Decision-Making, Social Problem-Solving Curricula for Grades K through 8, the new book, Emotionally Intelligent Parenting, and a book for young children, Talking Treasure, Stories to Help Build Emotional Intelligence and Resilience in Young Children. He writes a blog for educators and parents for the George Lucas Educational Foundation. And this is another exciting development with colleagues at the College of St. Elizabeth. He's developing an online credentialing program for direct instruction of social, emotional, and character development programs in classroom, small group, and after-school settings, and for school-focused coordination of social, emotional, and character development and school culture and climate. We hope some of you might consider becoming part of that exemplary program. So it's my pleasure. Maurice, great to see you again, and sure appreciate you doing this for us. And you're some of the folks in your webinar are about as far away from you are in New Jersey as what you are from California, but we may be small in number, but we're big in spirit. So glad to have you. Thank you.
This is great. I'm very excited to be able to do this and to be able to do it as a series, because there's a lot to talk about. But you know, Kelly said a lot of nice things. Some of them were true actually, but he said a lot of nice things. But here's what he left out. He left out about the fact that my daughter and son-in-law moved to East Windsor, New Jersey. So I'm in Highland Park. Highland Park is not far from Princeton, maybe about 25, 30 miles from New York City, not too far from Philly. And East Windsor is about 45 minutes from us. And when my daughter and son-in-law moved to East Windsor, they moved with my two grandsons, who are 3.5 and 7.5. Very shortly after they moved, I put a call in to the superintendent of East Windsor. And I said, I'd like to meet with you and your administrative team and building staff to talk about social and emotional learning. And he said, yes. So I went and I met with them. And I put my cards on the table. I said, my grandchildren are in your district. It is essential that you have competent social, emotional, and character development programming in your district, because my grandchildren are in there. So I say that by way of introduction, because what I'm talking about is something that it's not just an academic pursuit. This is serious business. It's very important what we're going to be talking about, and what I hope to be able to help you to implement beyond what I'm sure you're already doing. And so this first workshop, webinar, conversation is an overview, and I've designed it in a way to basically help you widen your own constituency around social, emotional, and character development. And obviously there are a lot of educators and folks you work with who are not on this webinar. And if we want to bring them along, then the only way we're going to bring them along is if they have a good sense of what this is. So I want to provide you with the background to be able to go back to your setting and bring people along. And everything that I'm going to share with you has been filtered through working with literally hundreds of schools in New Jersey and many schools around the country and internationally, all of whom are really catching up now to this whole process of social and emotional learning. And so with that, I would like to have you think with me about this. What is it that we need our kids to do to be ready for college, career, and community life in 2028? Because in point of fact, when we think about the kids who are in school now, or starting school now and just underway, that is the time when they're going to be graduating. And so we've got these wonderfully cute little kids that are starting out now. We have to think about, what are they going to be when they graduate? What is it that they're going to need when they are ready to take on adult responsibilities? So I'm going to, and this is my first technological challenge, but I'm going to show you a video. And I'd like you to think about and look at these projections about the future, which are embodied in this video. And we'll talk about them after you've seen it. Okay. So I'm curious to have you type into the chat box what it was that struck you of the many various projections about the future. Which would be the one that really seemed to capture your interest, capture your curiosity the most? Because this is challenging. It's challenging us to think about what we have to prepare our kids for. I know, for example, a lot of times when I'm presenting this to folks, they're often struck by the fact that there won't be any more car insurance, for example. The technology overpowering students, that depression is going to be such a big issue, that water is going to be such a focus of what we do, and how we really need to be having our kids think about these future problems starting today. So of all the issues that we see being identified, here is the basic truth, that while we are preparing our kids for an uncertain future, the constant is going to be the importance of caring interpersonal relationships. Because anything that happens in the future is going to be mediated by interpersonal relationships. And this is not something that is a recent discovery. Many cultures, including and especially often indigenous cultures recently celebrated, have a philosophy that a person is a person through other persons. And that it's not all about each of us as individuals. It's really all about us collectively. We may not realize.
Hi, Maurice. Let me cut in for just a second. We lost your audio.
Okay, how about now?
Yeah, I got you back. Thanks.
Okay, great. So, okay, thank you. So I was saying that Google no longer focuses on test scores because they're looking for a different kind of person. And think for a minute, what is it that Google is looking for that test scores can sometimes be misleading about? And if you think about that, you start to come to the idea of what does it take to be a successful Google employee, right? It's going to be someone who thinks out of the box. It's going to be someone who is a good problem solver. It's going to be someone who knows how to work in a team. And it's going to be somebody that doesn't have to have the credit. I noticed someone in the chat box said that they are one of the top employers of individuals with autism and without college degrees. And I think this reflects the fact that someone who might be on the spectrum may have very unique and divergent ways of looking at things that can be tremendously valuable. So as we begin to recognize that some of our old ideas and some of our present day focus is not actually being helpful to our kids, we have to ask ourselves, so what do we know with certainty? And here are a couple of things we know with certainty. One of them comes from the World Economic Forum. Now, the World Economic Forum, you know, is not like a teacher's organization. These are major players in the world economy that are very much concerned with the bottom line. And as you can see, this excerpt from the report, and you know the link on the bottom is to the full report. To thrive in the 21st century, students need more than traditional academic learning. They have to be adept at collaboration, communication, and problem solving, which are some of the skills developed through SEL, social and emotional learning. So we now have to start to think both and. Either or does not work. And there is a website called the Consortium for research in emotional intelligence in organizations. And at that website, you will find a tremendous amount of research that shows that companies that pay attention to the emotional intelligence of their employees do better on the bottom line than companies that don't. That's why the World Economic Forum is making a statement like this. It's not out of altruism. They're not goody two-shoes. And there's more that we know with certainty. We have to shift our focus. So I ask you to think for a moment about what is the dropout rate from college? That's not a rhetorical question. Think about it. Dropout rate from college is about 40 to 50%. If you happen to be a low-income minority kid, your dropout rate is closer to 80 to 90%. So the idea that schools can be satisfied to get kids to the college door is an antiquated way of thinking about schooling and education. Because what we know, and what you know from common sense in your own experience, is that to get through college, it's not just how academically smart you are. It's not just your IQ. It's also your EQ. And so when we come to understand the work that is listed on the bottom of the slide, Ready, Willing, and Able by Savitz-Romer and Bouffard, which was a study of why kids were not being successful in college in the Boston area, and Closing the Revolving Door, which is a study that we did at Rutgers, we begin to see that the reason that kids don't make it has to do with the fact that sometimes we so focus on their academic competencies that we do it to the exclusion of what they really need for success in life. So if we set a criterion, and if we evaluated our colleges and not evaluate our schools, not on how many kids get to college, but how many kids get through college, all of a sudden people would be jumping even more on the social emotional learning, social emotional character development bandwagon, because that's what makes the difference. And if you don't believe it about college, think about it for careers. The work of Dan Goleman and others are focusing on what we know about the workplace, as you saw on the World Economic Forum slide, basically makes it very clear that career continuity and success is much more about your emotional intelligence and your social and emotional skills than it is about your technical competencies. Think about committees that you've been on as a professional, work groups, task forces. Think about the people that you most like to work with. Are they necessarily the smartest ones? Nope. They're the ones that want to roll up their sleeves and get to work. They're the ones that are going to be willing to do stuff. These are the folks that have great emotional intelligence and bring that to the work effort and lift everyone up by what they do, not just by being competent and brilliant on their own. So again, we have to shift our focus toward what we know to be true for the future, and that is that for success in college and careers, as well as other things, we've got to focus on social and emotional competencies. Nicely summarized here by an elementary school principal in Missouri. Simply passing the accountability assessment is not enough for these kids to be able to navigate the complex world that they're going to be into. And so why is this so difficult? Well, one of the reasons it's difficult is because we have yet to appreciate the fact that social and emotional and character competencies are as basic, foundational, and essential to academic achievement as reading competence. And I think that this is an important and powerful statement, well worth your thinking about. Social and emotional and character competencies are not a program. They are fundamental possessions that we have that enable us to get through the world, like our ability to read, like our ability to breathe. That's how basic these competencies are and why we can't neglect them. But it ain't easy, because most of us work in schools like you're seeing on the top of this picture. It's what we call the jumbled schoolhouse. Jumbled schoolhouse is a schoolhouse with wonderful programs, loads of programs. Every program is evidence-based. Some are more evidence-based than the other. And every time there's a new mandate, we throw another program into the mix. So what happens is our schools become a jumbled mess of all good and well-intentioned things, but nevertheless, fragmented. I was talking about this to a group of superintendents, and one of the superintendents raises his hand from the back of the room. He says, I got it. I said, you know, what do you got? He says, it's like gardening. Well, I was born in the Bronx, New York. I know nothing about gardening. However, I am a psychologist. So I said, tell me more. So he starts telling me more. He says, you know, the school is like a patch of garden. It's like the soil. You can only put so many plants into the soil before they stop growing. They choke each other off, even though each of the plants individually is great. That's an analogy for the jumbled schoolhouse. And what always grows in a garden? No matter what you seem to be able to do, there's something that always grows in your garden. It's weeds, you got it. It's definitely weeds. We had a lot of weeds in our school. We got a lot of programs that we are doing that we brought in for one reason. We never quite got rid of them. We have programs that we bring in, and we're so crowded in our school agenda that we do half of this and half of that, something we would never do in a medical context. We'd never, you know, take 2 medications and dose ourselves with half of each. That doesn't work. It doesn't work in schools. So when we work with schools, we like to create the synergy that you see on the bottom, a schoolhouse of social, emotional competence and character, where academic skills are recognized as really, really important, but they are not a goal. They are a means to an end, that they rest on a foundation of service and character. My fundamental belief is that every child walks into one of our schools, 180 school days, and they walk in because they want to make a contribution to the world. They want to make the world a better place, and they want to be a good person when they do it. And if the school gives them the opportunity, if the school gives them the belief that this is possible, then they learn academics. The academics are in the service of service. And we want our kids to be smart kids with good character. The last thing you want to be known for is to be a school that turns out really smart kids with really poor character. Even though there may be a job market for those kids in Wall Street or Washington or something like that, we want our kids to have broader opportunities than just those. So we want our kids to have good character. Now, the rooms at the side of the schoolhouse, violence prevention, alcohol, tobacco, and other drug use education, health education, sex education, these rooms reflect the fact that kids cannot learn when they're hungry. They cannot learn when they're scared. They cannot learn when they're alcohol and drug involved. They cannot learn when they're involved in premature sexual behavior, and they cannot learn when they're not healthy. So the idea that schools could take resources away from these areas to put into academics, you can see from this diagram, is absolutely flawed, because these problems will cave in on academics if we are not providing the proper support for our kids and the proper staff to do that support. And so the social, emotional, and character development roof is because everything that happens in the school is based on the social, emotional, and character development of the people in it. The security guards, bus drivers, the lunch aides, people in the main office when people first walk into your school building, of course, the educational staff. So this is why we have to look at this jumbled mess that we have, and we have to look for synergy, where right now we don't have it. And this reflects the challenges that kids are bringing in every day when they come to school. So, you can see my list here, and you might have other things that are more indigenous to Alaska that are challenges for your kids that are not reflected in this list. And if there are, certainly would be good to chat about them and share that with folks. And while you're doing that, I will just mention a couple of these that are particularly salient from my point of view. Number one is the increased pace of life. And I admit, living in the Northeast, that life can be just crazy hectic, but I found that life is more hectic than people want it to be all over the place. And that the hecticness of life translates into sometimes crazy mornings in households before kids get out and come to school. And when kids come into school after an incredibly hectic, stressful morning, it affects their readiness to start learning. The greater economic demands on parents is something worth talking about also briefly. So, for example, I work with schools in Newark, New Jersey, an urban center, where parents have 5 children, but only enough food to feed 4 of those children. And so they spend all of their waking hours focusing on how are they going to get food for that poor 5th child. I also have worked with some very advantaged communities in New Jersey where parents have 5 cars, but only a garage for 4. And they spend a lot of their time worrying, how am I going to get a garage for that poor 5th car? Look, I don't make any judgments about this because the net effect is the same. Economic demands on parents, legitimate or not, it's not the issue. It takes parents away from the kids. So when our kids walk into school, the fundamental thing they want is to have a conversation with a caring adult who's genuinely interested in listening to them. And if we provide that kind of environment, we will find that kids will do almost anything for us. They'll even learn math. So this is really important to understand, that the challenges that the kids bring with them into school every day are indeed things that affect their ability and readiness to learn, even amidst outstanding curriculum delivery. I just make other, I see you've got issues with a high suicide rate. That's certainly very relevant. Mistrust, and based on cultural history, absolutely. I mean, these are things that kids do bring in with them. If you think about the next to last bullet point, climate of war, terror, and societal bullying and intimidation, our kids in school today, virtually none of them have been alive when our country has not been at war. Every one of our kids in school today, just about, has lived their entire life with our country at war. And up until fairly recently, that stuff was on the front pages. And what this means is that kids have to filter this information out. Kids who are old enough, kids are high school kids, are hearing stuff in the news. They're hearing about sexual predators. They're hearing about things that are going on in Middle East and massacres, and they're hearing about devastating floods. And I mean, this is stuff that they have to somehow find a way to emotionally manage if you're going to be able to sit in the classroom and absorb what we're all trying to teach them. And of course, in order to do that, they need to have skills. Otherwise, the high likelihood is they're just going to tune out of everything. So this is what leads us to think, or leads me anyway, and I hope perhaps you as well, that the work that we're doing and we're talking about is one of ethical and moral responsibility and educational equity. That it cannot be optional for kids to be in a positive school climate and to systematically learn social emotional competencies and character virtues which they need for life, college, and career success. It must be guaranteed. Our kids deserve this. And so for true educational equity and excellence, we have to prepare our kids for the tests of life, academic, civic, social, emotional, and character, and not mainly a life of tests. And once we can all get past the issue of whether this is a good thing to do or not, then we can get to the business of how. And we know how. So some of you may know about the program of state and national schools of character. This is a very, very powerful program that is organized by character.org, and it both provides a blueprint for schools of character and support in becoming schools of character. So New Jersey and Missouri are actually the two leading states for state and national school of character recognition. There is something going on now in a number of states. I'm not positive if Alaska is participating in this or not, but I have a feeling you'll get to it pretty soon. And that is that State Board of Education, Department of Education are creating lists of SEL competencies, resolutions for SEL competencies, even mandates for SEL competencies. I will tell you that in New Jersey, we resisted a mandate for SEL because we tend to find that mandates can backfire as often as they succeed, because mandates very often are proclaimed without funding and without infrastructure. And I think none of us really wants another unfunded mandate to jumble our schoolhouse. So better at this point to have a clear statement that these competencies are essential for our kids, and we encourage them. And then as professional educators, we have an obligation and responsibility to provide what our kids need. There are many examples of best practice models for SEL skill development. And there are networking organizations that are coming into play. On the last bullet point, successful, feasible, in-practice models for ongoing implementation support and continuous improvement. New Jersey has school support networks, and we recently have founded a group called SEL for NJ, which basically is a network of support so schools and educators can help one another succeed in their social, emotional, and character development work. And I believe that there has been some conversation about getting SEL for Alaska going, and it's only a matter of time before you do, especially if it's something that you really want to do. And the next to last bullet point talks about articulating principles for a culture of health, safety, support, and achievement in school. And that's going to be the topic of its own entire webinar by my colleague Danielle Hachimanji in a few weeks. So the skills that we're talking about are skills that may be familiar to some of you. Maybe you've seen this kind of wheel thing before. It comes from CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, casel.org. CASEL is kind of your one-stop shopping center for things relating to social emotional learning. It is CASEL that is directing the Collaborating States Initiative that is trying to get states to develop more policies around social, emotional, and character development. So there are only 5 SEL-related skills that we have to worry about. But these 5 skills are deceptively simple. They're simple in the sense that they are relevant from the moment we enter the earth until the moment we take our last breath. The skills don't change. There are skills in being able to recognize emotions in oneself and others. This is a huge deficiency area for many of our kids. They have a very constrained emotional vocabulary. They are often inaccurate in how they label their own emotions, and that has very negative consequences. because if we do not accurately label our emotions, we then act on the wrong information. Equally important is that when you have strong emotions, that you know how to manage them. Now, if you tend as a kid to over-attribute anger to yourself and to situations, as opposed to, for example, attributing frustration or disappointment, dejection, anger is an extremely difficult emotion to control. And so if you think you're angry when you're really not, you're going to find it's very hard to control your behavior. And so that's why so many kids that get angry at their parents, at their classmates, at their siblings, even at their teachers, are not really angry. They might be frustrated. They might be disappointed. They might be scared. But it comes out as anger, and then it becomes very hard for them to control their behavior. So the labeling process for our emotions is a skill that those of us that have it, at least to some reasonable degree, don't even think about it. If you don't have it, it can be a cause of tremendous difficulty. So we have to give our kids strategies for emotional management. We have to give them help in learning how to set and achieve realistic goals. That's part of self-management. We also have to think about building our kids' ability to show understanding and empathy for others. A couple of you in your chats have noted the fact that we seem to be in an era where understanding of others just does not seem to be that important. And yet it's vital. So we know the data. The data are that people can learn to be empathic. The data even suggests that males can be as empathic as females. Now, females, of course, I hear you doubting what I said. So I will qualify that by saying it might take males a heck of a lot of time to get there. But we can't use gender as an excuse. Even males can learn how to be empathic. And that is linked to their ability to form relationships, positive relationships, to work in teams, to be in a family, to be able to deal with conflict effectively, constructively, and not hold grudges. All of these things are essential social emotional skills that get played out in every classroom and every single day. Because if a kid cannot function in a group, well, they can ruin a classroom for everybody. And finally, responsible and ethical decision-making. So, look, I hardly have to say much about that. If your decision-making is not ethical, that's a real problem. And we see the consequences of unethical decision-making all around us. And on the other hand, we also see the consequences of faulty decision-making, when people are not taking the time to think about, what is my goal here? What are some alternative ways to solve this problem? I'm not jump at the first idea. What are the consequences? What are the consequences to myself, others, short-term, long-term, direct and indirect? And the ability to think about those consequences is so crucial in public life. It's a crucial skill for school board members, and we'll talk about school board members in just a second. So these 5 skill areas are deceptively simple, but they are what's needed for success in school and life. They are what I call participatory competencies, the competencies that need to participate.
Maurice, we lost you again.
How about now? We back?
We are back. Thanks.
Okay, great. So I mentioned school boards before, and I want to just share an anecdote with you about what happened when I was presenting on this topic to the New Jersey School Boards Association. Very powerful and influential group of people. So I was talking about this stuff, and I asked the question, so what kind of schools do you want your children to go to? And I got answers I wasn't expecting. We want our schools to be rigorous. We want our schools to give our kids a lot of work and keep them busy. They should have a lot of homework, and there should be tough, strict standards. I left the meeting, and I was shocked, honestly. I said, do these people hate their children? And how can they say this? I went back next year, a little wiser, and what I asked was a different question. I asked, what kind of schools do you want for your grandchildren? I got a very different answer. Schools for my grandchildren should be very supportive. They should be very understanding. There should be no yelling in the school for my grandchildren. And there certainly should be an eased up homework policy. For example, if on a Sunday the grandchildren go to visit their grandparents and maybe didn't get to finish their homework by Monday, there should be some understanding that when children visit their grandparents, you got to give them a little slack, right? So this is a standard, and I know that it fits inside of everybody, that when you think about your grandchildren, and of course you're looking at my grandchildren when they were younger, but that's them. When you think about your grandchildren, you think in a softer mode, and that softer mode takes you in actually a better developmental direction. It takes you in the direction where we understand how it is that children, students can truly achieve. They have to have climate, character, and SEL competencies. We've all been to workshops on the brain, and maybe some of you have missed those. I'm not sure how much you've missed, but in those workshops, sometimes the implication is that we have a left brain and a right brain and this brain and that brain. Last I checked, I think we only have one brain. And I will say my children sometimes have doubted whether I even have that, but that's another story. If we accept the fact that we only have one brain and that that brain is interconnected, it means that the intellectual, emotional, and social aspects of learning are inextricably interconnected. And since you all work with children, or for the vast majority of you work with children, you know that children are not primarily intellectual. They are primarily emotional. And so it is going to be their emotional state that plays a tremendous influence on what they do intellectually. So this is why when our kids walk into school, they should be walking into a positive character building school climate, which is going to be our topic on November 13th. But that is what opens up the possibility of learning. And then part of the learning is that they have to have explicit instruction in SEL skills, which we will be addressing in 2 subsequent webinars. And also we have to recognize that the NCLB era is gone. And in the current era, habits of mind and patterns of thinking have to be different. We have to include curiosity. Kids have to be able to explain their reasoning, not just know something, but explain why they know it. They have to be able to both give and get feedback. They have to learn how to ask good questions, and they have to be able to be good problem solvers. And the last thing they have to be able to do is to communicate clearly and proudly. There are so many kids out there, and I've worked for the last 15 years mostly in very challenged urban environments. I have seen so many kids that have a lot to offer. They have a lot to say. They have a lot to contribute, but they do not communicate effectively. And the world is not so enamored of all these kids that they are going to get out the best in them. Nope. If the kids can't get it out, sometimes it doesn't come out, and it's tragic. So when we help our kids to communicate clearly and proudly, we are giving them the potential to unlock the contributions they can make to their school, to their classmates, their classroom, to the society in general. Because ultimately, if you can't show it, it's as if you don't know it. So these habits of mind become really, really crucial aspects of the competencies that our kids need for their future life success. In New Jersey, we thought a lot about this issue of what makes for a learning organization. Schools should be learning organizations, but that doesn't mean they should just be organizations about learning. That learning should be what happens in the organization itself, that it learns how to get better. So a whole coalition of folks got together and set up some guidelines for positive culture and climate for any organization. And I would just mention 3 to call to your attention. Number 1 is inspiration. It's not by accident that that's first. I think that that's missing. I think in a lot of what we do with kids, we forget how important it is for them to feel inspired, for them to see inspiring exemplars. And we I think sometimes can just assume that because it's in the curriculum and it's important, that it'll be important to the kids. And some of you mentioned that the kids hardly see the relevance of the education that they're getting. Well, partly that's because we have not inspired them to understand the importance of what it is by seeing inspiring examples of what people have done with the learning, etc. Second thing I call your attention to is supportive. It's the idea of collective efficacy. Now, this is something that, quite honestly, in a Native American cultural context, it's a no-brainer. The idea that each individual is somehow responsible for their own well-being, it's ridiculous. Well, we've gone too much the opposite way. It's as if each individual is responsible only for their own well-being. So I'm going to tell you a quick story. When my older daughter, Sarah, was in first grade, she was, and she still is to some extent, she's big now, and she was a precocious reader. And she would read, get a reading assignment, and she would finish very quickly, and then she would start talking to all her classmates. Well, she had a traditional teacher, Irish lady, Mrs. Gash, and Mrs. Gash called my wife and I in for a parent-teacher conference. What's the problem? Oh, your daughter, Sarah, she's disrupting the entire class. Oh, what's she doing? Well, she finishes her reading and then she goes and she talks to everyone. I said, well, she's 6. What do you think she's going to do? Well, we can't have that. I mean, so what are you going to do about it? I mean, we're home. We can't stop her from doing that. But we do have a suggestion for you. Oh, what's that? Well, how about if when Sarah's done with her reading, you designate someone for her to go and help with their reading? No, I can't do that. Well, why can't you do that? Because how will I know that the student's progress is based on their own knowledge and not what Sarah did for them? Well, we said to her, Mrs. Gash, you have a problem. You're either going to have Sarah running around your classroom for an entire year, or you're going to have to think of other ways of knowing whether your students are really mastering the reading that they're doing, because Sarah will be helping them. Well, needless to say, Mrs. Gash gave it a try. Of course, it worked out wonderfully. But we haven't left that mentality. I mean, Sarah's now, as of this conversation, she's 39 years old. She is herself a teacher in an urban district. And what we understand is that collective efficacy is the way the world works. And so we have to have climates, cultures, where there's mutual support, where people literally can and do actively help each other get better. And that should be the norm. And that's related to the very last bullet point, which is about creating communities of learners. And communities of learners really mean the kids, but they also mean us. They mean the staff. And they don't just mean the staff, by the way, or the teaching staff. They mean the custodial staff. They mean the secretarial staff. They mean the technician staff. Everybody should be part of a community of learners. where we model for the kids that we're educators and we are learners. And we want you to be learners as well. So you'll talk more about this in the subsequent webinar that focuses on school culture and climate. But I just wanted to give you some things to think about whether or not you establish a comfortable learning environment in your classroom. How do you do that? What questions am I asking to, with, and about my students all year? How do I prepare my students to practice and apply new skills and information? Where do they find inspiration? How do I manage discipline? And what values support a restorative approach to discipline? Do you use a restorative approach to discipline, where we are looking to try to mend fences and have people who violate norms make contributions? And finally, what does my school and classroom stand for? What are 3 or 4 virtues that I most want my class to operate by and that I want my students to internalize? These are really essential elements in creating a positive culture and climate and creating a situation where we can unjumble the schoolhouse, because kids know what they stand for. They know what the classroom stands for, they know what the school stands for, and they typically then want to buy into that. And of course, they want to learn the competencies that will enable them to be good participants in all that. So as we move on in thinking about this work, I want to talk a little bit about what sometimes we refer to as SEL 2.0. The way in which social emotional learning has sort of migrated into social, emotional, and character development. And one of the most critical elements of that is focusing on what we call a mosaic approach. We want our kids to master skills and inspire character. If we think of skills as being the propeller, virtues are the rudder. And the journey of life requires both. I mean, in the past, there's been a split between social, emotional, and character, in part because we've felt that, well, one has to be more objective. But in reality, the assumptions of social and emotional learning are positive virtues and values. We want our kids to be using these skills for good. And so we should not hesitate to talk about that explicitly, because the journey of life requires skills and virtues. And we can agree on what key virtues are. We don't have to get into controversial issues. We don't have to get into religious issues. There are definitely some things that we can agree about, and that's the basis on which we should work. And here's one of them. It is reflected in the work of William Damon, who's talked about the importance of what he calls it noble purpose. My colleagues and I refer to as positive purpose. It is the intention to accomplish something that is both personally meaningful and in the service of a greater non-destructive good. I ask you to think a little bit about that and what the place of that has been in your work up to this point. Purpose is, again, something that is embedded within us as human beings. To live is to have purpose. And to have positive or noble purpose is what is tremendously motivating. Many of our kids walk into the school without a clear sense of purpose. This is not something that is going to be able to be valuable to them. We have come to understand, and there's a lot of research to support this, that a sense of purpose contributes tremendously to positive mental health. It is, in a way, an antidote, positive purpose is, an antidote to things like depression. And if you think about it, to suicide. You will be relatively unlikely to see someone who feels a strong sense of positive purpose, that they feel they're in the midst of providing something that's personally meaningful in the service of a greater non-destructive good, who will take their own life because their life has meaning. And I want to illustrate that for you with another video. This is a video that we use with a number of schools to introduce the idea of purpose. And you will see in the video Principal Kafele speaking about this. And I will tell you more about Principal Kafele after you watch the video. And as you watch it, think about how some of the kids that you work with might respond to it. Okay.
Greetings, young men. This is Principal Kafele, sitting out here on my patio in a hotel in Tampa, Florida, literally right next to the runway, so you're going to hear some planes as I'm talking. Just finished speaking to educators a few hours ago, came and changed my clothes, got a flight in about an hour or so. But as I always say, before I board that plane, I got a message for you. And that message comes in the form of a question. The question is, what is your purpose for walking into that classroom every day? Once again, young men, what is your purpose for walking into that classroom every day? Here's what I'm saying. You must have a purpose for walking into your classroom. You cannot walk into your classroom mindlessly. You cannot walk into your classroom aimlessly. You've got to have a specific reason for being there, and that is to learn. That is to maximize your potential so that you can connect your learning today with success in life later on in the future. Think about a dictionary. A dictionary is comprised of just thousands of words and definitions. And as you scan through that dictionary, you will not find a word with a blank space next to it, meaning that it is undefined. Every word in that dictionary has a definition. That means every word in that dictionary has meaning. Now let's transfer that back to your life. What I'm saying to you is your life must have a definition. Your life must have meaning. When you walk into that classroom, you must have meaning. You must have purpose. See, your purpose is your definition. Your purpose is your meaning for being in there. So you can't be in there and you're mindless. You're aimless. You're drifting. You're not focused. You're not serious. You're not diligent. You're not disciplined. You're not resilient. Those things cannot happen. They cannot be your experience in the classroom. Your experience must be that I am in fact serious. I am in fact focused, diligent, disciplined, and resilient because my life has purpose. You have taken the time with the assistance of your teachers or the assistance of your parents or other significant others and determined who you are. Defined who you are. Determine your specific meaning for existing, your specific meaning for being in that classroom. You have got to walk in that very narrow path, which I call your purpose for being. Make sure that when you walk into that classroom, you are walking in your purpose every day. And throughout the period, throughout the day, you are walking in your purpose. Enough said, young men. Let's go. Let's do it. Let's get it done. Let's make it happen. This is Principal Kafele. Once again, sitting on the patio in Tampa, right next to the airport. Thanks for listening. Peace.
Okay, so while take a minute and reflect in the chat box on what you think about the video and how you think your kids might respond to it. I'll tell you a little bit about Principal Kafele. He was, in fact, a principal for a number of years in a variety of urban schools, and then he's gone out and now he's a fabulous speaker. He has made over 200 of these videos, like you saw. A number of them are about purpose. They're about other topics. He was motivated to make these videos out of a deep concern for what was happening specifically to African-American boys. But we have used these videos with boys and girls African American, Muslim, Native American, you name it. We explained to them why he made the video and why he refers to young men in the video. And he's actually redoing some of these videos so that he can be a little bit more, if you will, neutral. But by the same token, they lack the spontaneity because this is his basic format. He's on the road speaking, and he could be in Tampa, Florida. He could be on his back patio of a hotel room. He could be any place. He does these impromptu videos. And indeed, these are conversation starters with kids. You know, some of you have commented on the fact that this could be a conversation starter for you. And I do find that kids benefit from these kinds of conversation starters. We will certainly talk a little bit more about this topic. But I wanted you to see a little bit more about how we can think and talk about purpose. And yes, students and staff want to think and talk about purpose. So this prompt that you see here is part of a purpose essay assignment that is given to kids 5th grade and up in language arts class. And so the idea is that in almost every language arts class, the kids are learning how to write an essay. And they have a structure that they use for how to write an essay. And so if you make the topic of purpose, maybe your purpose, maybe someone else's purpose, but the topic of purpose, the topic of the essay, you then can infuse this into the curriculum without changing it at all, because you're not adding anything into the jumbled schoolhouse. You're simply redirecting part of the existing lesson structure into the topic of purpose. So these kids are learning a 5-paragraph essay. Has to have an introduction, 3 body paragraphs, and a conclusion. And then they have to respond to these 3 questions. What is your definition of purpose? What might be your purpose? And how would someone know that this is your purpose in life? And that 3rd question is an incredibly powerful question when you're dealing with kids with any kind of behavioral difficulties. And we will talk more about this in a later webinar. But just think about how kids' behavior can be reinterpreted and reappraised as a commentary on their sense of purpose. And many kids, when you ask them, will give you a laudable sense of purpose. But then, of course, when you look at their actions, you see incongruence. And that raises a very important topic. And the topic, though, doesn't accuse the kids of psychopathology or anything. It's a bemused wonderment. You say your purpose is this, but then your actions are that. You say you want to be a doctor someday, but you pass up opportunities to study for your exams and get the grades you need to go to medical school. How should I understand this? And those are very different conversations than the conversations that often naturally lead into a remediation type of conversation and relationship. As I said, we will talk more about it. Here are a couple of other prompts that give our kids the opportunity to think about the things that are important to them in life. What is one rule that you believe is important to live your life by that gives your life meaning and purpose? If you could change one thing about yourself, what would it be? Is there a situation or place that you think is unfair, makes you upset, that you can't stand? Sometimes we can find our sense of purpose by what we don't like. And if we lived in a perfect world, how would people behave differently than they do now? So I noticed one of you, some of you are saying that your students are so focused on, shall we say, one level of Maslow's hierarchy, the very basic levels, that they might not grasp the concept of purpose. I will tell you that school needs to be that different place. That even though they don't put out of their minds everything that happens when they are at home, nor should they. School is a place where we have to inspire them. We have to inspire them with possibilities. And because these things are so basic, because having a sense of purpose is basic, because some of us believe, some researchers believe, that we are pre-wired. We are pre-wired to want to make a contribution beyond ourselves. That this is something that we can tap into with our kids. And one way of getting them to that point, something we'll talk more about in subsequent webinars, but I just want to address some of this that you're saying, is by having kids read biographies and look at the biography in terms of understanding the purpose of the person they're reading about. Even children's books can be understood with the language of purpose. You could even read Dr. Seuss and ask about the purpose of the Cat in the Hat and the purpose of the kids in the story. So again, this is a developmental process. And for kids who have really never thought about it, we do have to bring them along, and we have to bring them along in tangible ways. And the most tangible ways are things that will actually be about others before themselves. I'll tell you this though. And when I worked and have worked in these low-income districts, we've asked kids to do the assignment based on that first bullet point. Think about a rule that they believe is important to live by, their law of life. Before we've asked them to formulate this, we asked them to go home and talk to their families about it. And these have been revelatory activities because when kids have talked to, not necessarily parents, because many of these kids didn't have a parent in the home, grandparent, uncle, aunt, whatever, they heard some amazing things. Because, you know, it is the case that sometimes our purpose gets beaten out of us, but it was there. And sometimes our kids see the spark of purpose in their own families that seem so beset by trouble and trauma, and yet they see a spark. And that spark can be a game changer for many kids. So I don't despair of it, and I hope that you will not despair of it either. Okay, so if we can do a little bit of a review, I hope now that you can begin to see that social emotional character development, purpose, a positive mindset, and social action are connected. Social emotional character development, as we said, are basic, foundational, and essential to academic achievement as reading competence, and they have to be fostered in schools of character that focus on supporting and actualizing the student's sense of positive purpose. When students have a positive purpose and a mindset of contribution, they're willing to learn and cooperate for social action. And I would be mistaken, or maybe I would say disingenuous, if I didn't say that part of the agenda here is to get our kids more actively engaged in the processes of citizenship in their villages, in their communities, in their cities, states, and in their countries, and in this global world where our kids, as we saw in the video in the very beginning, are going to be called upon to be servant leaders in a global world. That's what awaits them. And we will be talking more about social action and engagement in some upcoming webinars. So here, again, by way of summary, this comes from a book called Social Emotional Learning. What does the research say? It's published by Teachers College Press. Costs about $50. I'm saving you $50 because the entire book is on this slide. No need to send me any money. I want you to look at what looks to me like an orange box that says better resilience and competence and success in school and life. Because the goal here is not success in school, but it really is about resilience and success in life. And the best predictor of that is greater attachment, engagement, and commitment to a school of character. When kids walk into a school that they feel means something, and they mean something to the school, then you've got something going here. That gets operationalized by children having an opportunity to make a positive contribution, recognition, and a sense of purpose and pride in being in school. And that's something for all children. That it's not, again, it's not an aspiration, it's an obligation. Because when we open up those doors in the morning and we let the kids in, why are we letting them in? We got to be letting them in because we think that they're going to have a positive contribution. They're going to do something that we can recognize them for positively. That there's a reason for them to be there, and they should be proud to be there. And that should be true of every single kid. The poorest kid, the richest kid. Kids of every ethnic background, kids of every kind of ability and challenge. And they need to be in classrooms that are well-managed learning environments. It is so important that kids need to be able to raise their hand and not worried about being bullied and intimidated, that when they raise their hand, they'll be called on, at least periodically. All those things are critical. And that they are going to have evidence-based social, emotional, and character development programming that will support them and teach them skills. The result of this, going back to what we talked about earlier, is less risky behavior. Because a lot of high-risk behavior that we see in kids, and that includes a lot of alcohol, drug use, dangerous driving, etc., is because they've got nothing to lose. Because if I've got no purpose, I've got no anchor, I've got no place, not the home, not the school, where I feel valued, then the harm that I might do to myself, getting myself suspended from school, what's the difference? I may actually feel better being suspended than I do being in school. I have worked with a number of schools where the kids literally would work to get themselves an in-school suspension because the environment in the classroom was so toxic to them. But when the environment changes and the kids feel that they have a positive contribution to make, then they've got something to lose. And so the risky behavior actually is risky because they're risking something. And the data are compelling about this. The data suggest that when we do this work for more than 1 year, again, these findings that you see on this page apply only to work that's done for at least 2 years. The kids can learn the skills, they get better attitudes, positive classroom behavior, and that fourth bullet point, 10 to 11 percentage point gains on standardized achievement tests. I would ask you to, put in the chat box why and how it is you think that social and emotional and character competencies would yield 10 to 11 percentage point gains on standardized achievement tests. Because this is something that once we can really be clear about and convince people about, begins to open up more doors for accepting these types of efforts in our schools. We somehow can make time for something when it yields this kind of percentage gain on standardized achievement tests, because these gains don't happen from a longer school day or a longer school year or a lot of summer recovery programs. They happen when there's social and emotional competence development going on in our schools systematically and over time. And the classroom environment itself gets better. Fewer conduct problems, fewer aggressive behaviors, and less emotional distress. Now, this translates into lower teacher turnover, lower teacher absenteeism. Why? Because the kids become more pleasant to be with. I mean, it's, 180 school days. Would I rather have pleasant kids or unpleasant kids? Well, I think I'd rather have pleasant kids myself. That's my bias. So you're talking about something here that is going to be beneficial to the educators and beneficial to the kids and beneficial to the system. And as we look in the chat box, we can see some of the many reasons, right, why kids' test scores go up. I'll give you a specific example from one of my grad students who did his master's in a bunch of schools in part of New Jersey near Rutgers. And here's what he did. He said he went to math classes and he had a randomized control test. There were 3 conditions. In one condition, the kids were taught a breathing technique to calm themselves down before a test. In another condition, the kids were taught positive self-talk by having them talk to themselves about how they did well on tests in the past, whether in math or in some other subject area before the test. In the third condition, the kids were told the usual things that kids are told to prepare for a test. So now think when you were younger and you had a test, what did your teachers tell you to do to prepare for the test? Typically, there are 3 things. Number 1, study. Number 2, get a good night's sleep. Number 3, have a good breakfast. So some kids were told that. Some kids were taught breathing. Some kids were taught self-talk. Well, obviously, you know the answer. In the randomized controlled trial, over the course of a whole year, whether it was math quizzes or big tests, the kids that had the emotional control strategies did better. They obviously weren't getting smarter. Didn't make them smarter. Didn't make them better at math. It just made them better able to use the skills they had in the test situation. And a number of you have talked about the benefits that would accrue not only in the test moment, but a lot of other times before that, which of course would lead the kids to be better prepared, etc. But it's important, and I hope you'll be able to even copy this section of the chat, if not the whole chat, because this is what we need to be able to talk to people about. And, you know, most of the time when you have this kind of conversation with folks, it's not like you have to really convince them. They just haven't really thought about it. And it makes a lot of intuitive sense. By the way, on the very bottom of the slide is a listing of well over 200 studies that support the findings that are on this slide. So we're talking about something that we do not have to be apologetic about. We can be very confident about it. So how do we move forward, right? And I just want to, again, go through a few brief kind of review things by way of getting us toward our conclusion. So number 1, let's remember that there are certain fundamental principles for social and emotional and character development. One is that our school stands for something, that everyone knows it and everyone is included. Number 2, caring relationships form the foundation for all lasting learning. Number 3 is that emotions strongly affect how and what we learn. We cannot pretend that when a kid walks into a school, they put their books and their jacket and their emotions in the locker. Nope. Emotions go with them every single place in that school. Number 4, children benefit from knowing their laws of life and having a sense of positive purpose. Number 5, goal setting and problem solving provide cohesiveness, focus, direction, and energy for learning. That again, to prepare our kids for this uncertain future, we must give them excellent goal setting and problem solving skills. So we know from the literature that the schools of the future that are going to be preparing our kids for the future will have systematic, comprehensive, and effective approaches to school-wide social, emotional, and character development. Taking a page from, I think it's a Gatorade commercial, we have to turn what seems incredible into inevitable, and what seems inconceivable into achievable. And this is the importance of some of the networking things that I was talking about earlier. Because there are a lot of things that, you know, when we look around, well, that can't be done. Well, then we find out that there are a lot of places just like us that are doing it. And so what seems like an incredible exception is really just a step toward the inevitable widespread adoption of this work. And what now may seem inconceivable, how are we ever going to get past all these issues and problems and truly have a school of character? Well, it's achievable because there are a lot of schools that have overcome tremendous difficulty, like some of the ones you're experiencing. And of course, if you network with them, then you definitely can get assistance on the path. And so we know that social emotional character development is not just a program. It really is a multi-year school improvement strategy. Yes, there are ways of using SEL with our individual kids in Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. We will talk about all that. But the highest aspiration here is to think about social, emotional, and character development as part of a multi-year school improvement strategy. It gives a common language. We're talking about these issues that very often is lacking in schools. So the common language structure of social emotional skills becomes useful. That we have to have flexibility with consistency, so that even if you're adopting a set program like a second step or open circle, or social decision making, or paths, or ruler, all are wonderful, but you have to make them work in your school. So you have to be flexible with them. You have to be flexible but consistent. So you've got to find a way of making adaptations work in your school. And then once you've made those, then they have to be consistent so that we can count on things happening from year to year to year to year. That indeed we have to build skills. We cannot just infuse SECD. We've got to teach the kids the skills we want them to have. And that ultimately the internalization comes because we integrate across all subject areas via themes, skills, core virtues. And we will be talking about a lot of how this applies in Tier 2 upcoming. So Kelly mentioned at the outset another resource, and I will take a moment and just talk about this with you. The Academy for Social Emotional Learning in Schools was set up because many individuals find themselves wanting to develop competency in SEL, but they don't have a lot of local support. And so the Academy has 2 certificate programs that are basically online programs. One is for school leadership in social emotional character development, school culture and climate, and the other is for instruction in social emotional character development. So again, just to make sure the nuance is clear, it is a different skill set to bring SEL, SECD school-wide than it is to sit with a group of kids, either in a counseling context, classroom context, or an after-school context, and teach them specific social emotional skills. Obviously, the skill sets are founded in the same core fundamental knowledge, but as a matter of practice, they're different. And so the certificate programs consist of 2 courses each, and then an online practicum where you actually get supervision in and guidance in implementing the work as part of the certificate process. And after you go through the 2 courses and the practicum, and you get your certificate, you become part of a virtual professional learning community where you get access to expertise in SEL to help you with implementation subsequently. You know, in a way, think of a certificate like this as like a kind of like a driver's license. You know, you're certainly qualified to drive, but it wouldn't be a great idea to go off to the Amalfi Coast in Italy and start negotiating hairpin turns without a guardrail. Not smart. Got to work your way up to that. But the same thing here. Now, some of you have been doing SEL-related work for many years and have not gotten recognition for it. And so within the instruction certificate, there is an accelerated track that recognizes the fact that folks that have been doing this work for at least 5 years can go a little faster and get to the point of credentialing a little bit sooner. Again, it's selinschools.org, and you can get some information there that will give you some more details. So I want to close with a couple of thoughts, that the paths to purpose come from service, inspiration, and finding a calling. Albert Schweitzer said, "One thing I know, the only ones among you who will really be happy are those who will have sought and found how to serve." Albert Schweitzer anticipated so much of the research now in positive psychology and happiness, which is that it's not about material possessions. So much of it is about what you're able to do for others, source of true happiness and purpose. Viktor Frankl said, "It did not matter what we expected from life, but rather what life expected of us." So his idea is that we all have a calling. We don't know what that calling necessarily is going to be. And schools are places where kids need to find their calling. And so if schools are very rigid and schools have no tolerance for people that do things a little differently than everybody else, then we are depriving a lot of kids of finding their calling and being great contributors to the world around them. And finally, Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Everyone can be great because everyone can serve." And I think that you see this recurring message, and that's because we recognize its truth as a promoter of mental health, as a promoter of academic development, and as a promoter of social civic discourse. We all benefit through learning how to serve. So we've talked about a lot of things, and I just would say that as you sort out from the many things we've talked about, I hope you'll heed some of the work of John Wooden, the great basketball coach, who said, "Don't let what you cannot do interfere with what you can do." That maybe your situation now will only allow you to do a small piece of some of the things we've talked about and we'll talk about in future webinars. But there are things you can do. And everything that you start doing will potentiate being able to do more and take the next steps. John Wooden didn't let his team look at the film of other teams. He only wanted his team to be the best that they could be. Do what you can do. And that's what I would hope for you. And it's because the children are waiting. Children have waited for a long time. And they're waiting for us now to really prepare them for the future, to think about them and not about ourselves, to think not about how good our schools are going to look, but rather how good our schools are going to be and how good our schools are going to do for our kids. So if there are there have been some good questions and good comments, certainly in the chat box. We have a couple minutes. If there might be some specific questions that pop up, I'm more than happy to take a look at them. I see some of you are resonating to the message, and I'm grateful for your positive comments. I definitely look forward to the next installments where we're going to get into some more detail and specifics, even more of the how-to stuff, and because obviously that's the point. Melissa, I hear you in the background.
And this is Diana Kirka, and I'll be taking over from you, Maurice, and if we're ready. And I see a lot of questions coming in, and if you see some things that you need to answer, please pop right back in. We want to thank you so much for a wealth of information. What I'd like to do right now is just remind everybody that one of the things we found is if you take the webinar for credit, you get to apply all this information and you get to hear what others are thinking and doing and processing the information that comes in a large amount in a short amount of time. but then we get to talk to others at our grade level, others in our content area, and we have a chance to just get to know others in the community so we can make contacts. And I found just by taking it for credit, the application piece takes effect, and it really is just a great opportunity. So I just wanted to let you know that if you do decide to take the option for taking the webinar for credit, you can register for credit online. And if you look in the chat box, I don't believe these links are live because we were using the other screen, but Melissa has posted those into the chat box. Don't worry, if you do not want to think about that tonight, you don't have to, because we won't be closing registration until November 1st. Of course, others are going to be getting online and starting to use this information, apply the information, and actually make some of the decisions about what they're going to do for their class or their school or their district. The course requirements are you participate in the webcast, and it's important that you do, but we know that there are, parent-teacher conferences, there are dentist appointments, there's things that have come up in life. So if you miss a webinar, not a problem, you can still take it for credit, because the recordings will be posted approximately 24 hours after you have viewed the live broadcast. So that's all on the resource website. We'll post the video clip links there as well, so that you can go back and look at those. That's where you'll find your PowerPoint materials. Everything is in one spot, and you just click on it. We will have an application paper, and I'm going to explain that to you next, and that's due coming up in February, because our classes are spread out. You'll be participating in the 6 webinars for the evaluation. You'll be posting comments on a discussion site after each webinar. And don't worry, there's a period of time to do that. And then you'll also be replying or responding to one other participant's comments that have been made. So we get some dialogue going back and forth. Then you'll submit a reflection, and it's actually an application paper, because it's exactly what you've been doing. When you've posted these comments, you've practically written your paper. The paper is 3 to 4 pages long. It's a description of your classroom. That's so we kind of know where you are. And then documentation of the information that you've seen and heard through the webinars and discussions. And then what are you going to do with this? And it may be number 2 and number 3 fall together, and that's just fine. You're going to be emailing me your paper, and I'll let you know that I receive your paper. Do not worry about all this information. I'm going to post this on step 1 if you do take the webinar for credit. So that's going to come out. And if you've got some questions about any of this, you can always email me. I posted my email in the chat box, and then I can answer your specific questions by yourself. If you are there with a team, you could do this as a team paper, and you can develop a school-wide plan. And boy, we've seen settings change, a whole new way of looking at things when you work together, either the grade level team, vertical teams, school teams, whatever. But you'll just write a short paragraph about your part in the development of that paper. But the rest of it is all what you do as a team and how you're going to make change in your building, your district, or your grade level classrooms. And then you'll, of course, email your paper to me. Before you leave, if you haven't decided whether or not you want to take it for credit, we really appreciate your input. And so we've got a brief survey coming up. And I think the survey is in the chat box right now, that link. If you click on it, it takes about 2 minutes. If you're there with the team, fill out that survey as a team, just letting Maurice know where we're headed, what you need more of, and it lets the team at the Alaska Staff Development Network know we're on the right track with the classes and the presentations that are being provided. So we do appreciate your feedback. And Scott, you're not familiar with the format. If you received a notification to get online here, then in that email that you got to get you signed up for the Zoom website tonight, you have the link to the resource page. You can click on right on the screen, the webinar resource page. That will take you right there. And the survey is there also. So you can just click on the webinar resource page. You can also then get the survey. You can also register for credit through that link that's on the resource page. Everything is right in the same place on the webinar resource page. And you can email me and I can send you all that information as well. Any other questions that you might have? Sarah, introductory session was tonight.